Welcome to the American History Book Club and a very special warm welcome to our speaker, Bob Dotson. I'm so glad each of you have joined us. Many of you have met and have heard our speaker. You probably recognized his voice before you put the name and the face together. I suspect the odds are even greater that you remember watching Bob on the Today Show. Bob was a regular on that feature for more than 40 years until his retirement and his and Linda's move to Greenville. Throughout his career, Bob repeatedly proved that storytelling lies at the heart of all of our lives. Bob has written 4 books, one of which is the New York Times bestseller, American Story, a lifetime search for ordinary people doing extraordinary things. If you don't have a copy of the book, you can pick that up in the Upcountry History Museum's bookshop, and you might be lucky enough to get an autographed copy. In order to write this book, Bob crisscrossed this country for more than 4 million miles, searching for invisible people, people who had changed lives, but who were not necessarily Twitters. A native of St. Louis and a graduate of Kansas University, Bob has, over the course of his career, been nominated for 11 national Emmys, and he won 7 more after he became an NBC News correspondent in 1975. Bob has produced many documentaries. One NBC production, El Capitan's Courageous Climbers, won 7 International Film Festival honors, including the highest honor given. His reporting and storytelling have earned Bob 120 awards around the world, including top honors from the Kennedy Center, DuPont Columbia, and listen to this, a record-setting 6 Edward R. Murrow Awards for Best Network News Writing. Today, just in his spare time, Bob conducts workshops in Korea, Australia, England, Holland, Switzerland, and Austria. Between those workshops, he is a professor of master storytelling at Syracuse University. Most Americans, as you know, read less than 19 minutes a day. That is pitiful. But we love to tell stories. We can do that in abundance. So now the obvious question is, what in the world are Bob and Linda Dotson doing in Greenville? We know Greenville is invisible in New York or in Boston or in San Francisco, but we know, oh yeah, it's that Greenville in South Carolina. Well, 6 weeks after his retirement, Bob and Linda left New York and traveled the back roads of America, searching for their invisible American city. They said they wanted a city that had been built on the bedrock of America. What attracted Bob to Greenville, he said, was he wanted to live in a city that had been willing to tear down a perfectly good bridge in order to see a magnificent waterfall. He wanted to live in a city in which one woman was responsible for building a free residential high school for aspiring artists. And he certainly wanted to live in a city where a poor Jewish immigrant could be elected mayor and be reelected repeatedly. So it was that on their 45th wedding anniversary, Bob and Linda Dotson bought the first house they saw for sale on Arthur Avenue, a house within walking distance to the Lewis Plaza, and one I could almost see from the house in which I grew up. Once again, the invisible became visible to Bob. As I prepared this introduction, it really struck me that Bob Dotson is a walking example of the people he writes about. Like so many of you who are members of the American History Book Club, he is an ordinary American accomplishing extraordinary things, but because he believes in all the good things about this country and about its people. I hope you will join me in welcoming Bob Dotson to the American History Book Club. Thank you.
Thanks for that lovely introduction. My knowledge of American history is not bound in books. I've crisscrossed this country for nearly half a century, more than 4 million miles, searching for stories hiding in history's shadows. You know, you don't bounce around that long without discovering fascinating tales that seldom made it into the history books. They always involve more than we think we know. So let's see what happened after history's spotlight moves on. Remember the Alamo? Sure you do. The general who won that battle did more than knock Davy Crockett off a wall. That fight led to Texas independence in 1847. 20 years later, General Santa Anna lived on Staten Island in New York City. His secretary watched him chewing something one day and wondered why the general never swallowed it. Santa Anna showed him a rubber-like substance he brought with him from Mexico. The secretary gave a piece to a friend, Thomas Adams. Adams added flavorings and sweeteners. He called the bite-sized bits chiclets. Santa Anna is remembered for that famous fight at the Alamo, but his lasting legacy, rubber chewing gum, is stuck under hundreds of high school desks. America has always been a beacon for people with unusual ideas. Here they found the freedom to try them. We all remember what happened when two lights blinked bright in Boston's Old North Church. Paul Revere rode away and the American Revolution began. But 25 years before that, John Childs jumped from the same belfry 3 times, holding a big umbrella with wings, and thus surviving one of the world's first parachute jumps. 2 centuries later, a 14-year-old farm boy invented television. That's right, TV did not begin in New York City or Los Angeles. It was the vision of a fellow with a funny name, Philo T. Farnsworth. Philo was plowing a field on the family farm near Rigby, Idaho, daydreaming about sending pictures of the sky, when he noticed the sun glinting off the parallel lines of potatoes he had just planted. In a single blazing moment of inspiration, it occurred to him that a picture also could be broken into lines, beamed into space, and then put back together on a television set. The teenager drew a sketch of his camera tube and showed it to his chemistry teacher. He was impressed. That's all Philo needed. By his 21st birthday, with no formal training, Philo T. Farnsworth had successfully built a TV camera that could send the world to us. In Philo's hometown, kids celebrated his 100th birthday with an invention convention. A 9-year-old decided her partially blind teacher needed Braille socks. The teacher could feel the color by touching the bumps. Tristan Sorensen invented something he called the snotty sleeve saver. You just took a pack of Kleenex on your arm, and when you need to wipe your nose, Tristan was not much younger than Philo when he invented TV. Nice to know the kids in Farnsworth's hometown still have his rare gift to see what we all see, but think what no one else has thought. That's the sort of thinking that built this country. Our history is packed with stories of people who traveled out beyond the limits of their settled lives, searching for places where dreams could flourish. You know, for a pioneer, home is not always where you are, but where you want to be. You ever wonder why the Pilgrims picked 1620 to sail into the unknown? The historian at the Pilgrims Museum in the Netherlands told me the elders were worried. When their sons became teenagers, they started learning Dutch so they could hone their pickup lines on the local girls. The dads decided it was time to go. They sailed away, not on the Mayflower, the Speedwell. It didn't speed well. It leaked. So they sold it in Southampton, England, and transferred to that other, more famous ship. By the way, there were 102 people on board. 35 million of us, that's 35 million living today, can trace our family's history to the Mayflower. Fewer than half of the passengers were pilgrims. Some simply wanted to make a new start in North America, but not necessarily for religious reasons. A Native American welcomed them in their own language. Squanto had traveled extensively throughout Europe. Explorers kidnapped him, took him to Spain, sold him into slavery. He also spent 10 years in England learning the language that would help him teach the Pilgrims a lot more than how to plant corn. A year before they stepped onto that famous rock, Squanto finally made it home, only to discover that his tribe had all been but wiped out, not in battle, but by diseases the explorers had brought with them. But he made sure America's first immigrants survived, and that is why we celebrate Thanksgiving together. This country was built by folks like that, people who saw what needed to be done and did it without fanfare or even the hope of a great lunch. You remember Sitting Bull, the Indian who helped defeat General Custer at the Little Bighorn? He was a great war chief of the Lakota Sioux Indian tribe, but he was also a man who cared deeply about children. Buffalo Bill Cody took him to New York City one time to perform in his Wild West show. A few weeks later, Buffalo Bill received a letter from Mrs. Sitting Bull. She said, "I only let my husband go because he promised to send home half his pay." They had a lot of grandkids to look after. Check didn't show up. Buffalo Bill said he'd find out why. Lewis Whirlwind Horse remembered what Bill discovered. When I met him, Lewis was the last living performer of the Wild West show. This is what Cody wrote back to Mrs. Sitting Bull. "You won't understand this. In your tribe, there are no orphans. But in New York City, your husband sees hundreds of them every day. Sitting Bull cashed his paycheck and bought food, which he passes out to kids living in the alleys." Here's another one. P.S. Who's the savage? Childhood should be a season of dreams, but some children awake each morning from an American nightmare. They are born addicted to drugs. A woman who never made it into our history books saved hundreds of them. Clara Hale faced life with antique courage. She did not set out to do saintly things. In fact, she was retiring when a drug-addicted mother left her baby by the door. Mrs. Hale took him in, and word got around, and soon her tiny apartment was jammed with cribs. She had already spent a lifetime caring for other people's children. Her husband died early, and she supported her family by raising 40 neighborhood kids. She had 3 of her own. All 43 went to college. They all graduated. Mama Hale, as the kids called her, agreed to take care of these new babies on one condition, that their mothers enter drug rehabilitation programs. She did not want to send those children back to mean streets. Before I met Mrs. Hale, 500 drug-addicted babies had passed through her home. All but 11 had been returned to their mothers. I asked her if she thought she would ever run out of love. She kissed the baby's knuckle and said, "I think if I ran out of love, I'd be out of life." Mama Hale could not recall a night without babies by her bed. She had been taking care of them since she was 14. There was no magic to what she did, just love. And that was the best magic of all. Telling tales on television is a bit like riding on smoke. They soon drift away. But stories that reveal our better selves linger. They become signposts pointing to the capabilities of the human spirit. Jack McConnell stopped to pick up a man who was walking down a dirt road without an umbrella on a drizzly day. "Where are you headed?" McConnell called out of the window. "To look for a job," the man answered. "Anyone I can get. I've got 2 kids and my wife is pregnant with our 3rd. "What do you do for medical care?" McConnell wondered. He was a retired doctor. "We have to take care of ourselves," the man said. "No one else is going to help us." His answer would change thousands of lives across this country. It started Jack McConnell thinking about all the other people he'd seen trudging by him on his way to play golf, waitresses, maids, and the army of workers who preened his retirement paradise on Hilton Head Island. 6,000 working poor could rarely afford to see a doctor. McConnell decided to treat them for free, and soon began recruiting other doctors. At first, they resisted. Few of them were licensed to practice in South Carolina, and some were worried that they'd be sued, perhaps lose their entire life savings. McConnell persuaded lawmakers to waive the licensing fees and got cheap insurance that would cover everyone working in the clinic. How safe were these older doctors? 2/3 of them were on medical school faculty. They not only kept current, but they taught younger doctors as well. The clinic does more than patch up poor people. Doctors take time to get to know patients as friends. One woman was struggling, even though she worked 6 jobs. The medical volunteers helped her out, and in return, her entire family showed up to clean the clinic every night after work. Before the pandemic, this country had 250,000 retired doctors and 2 million nurses who had stopped taking care of the sick, even though they were young enough to do so. McConnell cited those statistics as he gazed upon his packed waiting room. What he'd achieved in Hilton Head inspired others to open volunteer clinics all around the nation. Why did he do it? My mom used to ask us kids at dinner, "Who did you help today?" he said. "If no one, just pass the potatoes. But if you did help someone, you became the hero of the evening." It's not where you come from or where you're going, but who you help along the way that makes the difference in life. Arvidas Zildjian lured good workers to his company in suburban Boston with another simple promise: "You take care of my family, and I'll take care of yours." That pledge has remained unbroken for nearly 100 years. When was the last time you heard a factory worker say, "I've been here a quarter of a century, and I've never seen a layoff"? Whenever a task is automated, the employee who performed it is trained for another, worth equivalent pay. George Plaskas, a Greek immigrant, had been retrained 7 times in 40 years. He raised 2 kids in a solidly middle-class neighborhood. One became a doctor. Many of America's successful businesses were built by people in front offices who looked beyond quarterly profits. Arvidas Zildjian's granddaughter now heads the company. Craigie Zildjian offers incentive pay not just for working faster or producing more, but also for doing jobs right the first time. Every person on the line must approve the work they do before that product is moved on. That's a big reason why the company has never outsourced a job. The Zildjian Company has outlasted empires. The family began making cymbals in Turkey back in 1623, survived the move to Massachusetts, and thrived even during economic turmoil. Quality became more than a slogan. The 125 Americans in this little factory cornered more than half the cymbal market in the world. Are the Zildjians tempted to sell the company and make big bucks? Almost weekly. But they plan to hand it down to their great-granddaughter, Amelia, one day. The 16th generation. That's the kind of family who could make the faces on Mount Rushmore grin. Traveling the country, finding stories to tell didn't seem like history at the time, but history never does. I was filming in a graveyard one day when I happened upon the headstone of a guy named Doc Adams. It said he was baseball's first shortstop. Turns out, he created the position. Now, most of us remember Abner Doubleday as the inventor of baseball. Well, he did not. He was the first Union soldier to return fire at Fort Sumter at the start of the Civil War. Doubleday was honored with New York City's first ticker tape parade. After the war, he moved to San Francisco and helped start another cultural icon, cable cars. But every year, nearly 300,000 people pass through the Baseball Hall of Fame thinking Doubleday created America's pastime. You can thank Al Spalding for that. He manufactured sporting equipment and saw dollars draining away when an English employee, Henry Chadwick, pointed out that baseball came from Great Britain. Kids there called it rounders. Spalding, of course, argued the game was 100% American. Chadwick explained that rounders is played with a bat and a ball, a pitcher and a batter who runs counterclockwise around the bases. Case closed. Not quite. Spalding had a lot to lose, so he formed a commission to find the American who designed this country's favorite sport. 3 years later, the group came back with a wonderful story. Abner Doubleday had sketched the rules of baseball in the dirt with a stick. Spalding trumpeted the news. An American boy had invented America's game in Cooperstown, an all-American village. Doubleday was dead, so no one could ask him if the story were true. But the year he was supposed to have thought up the game, 1839, Doubleday was an Army cadet at West Point. He never went home to Cooperstown. His parents no longer lived there. Didn't matter. 10 years later, in the depths of the Great Depression, a Cooperstown booster used Spalding's tale to make a pitch for baseball's Hall of Fame. Well, you know the rest. Abner Doubleday is remembered because of a spin-doctored story people wanted to believe. And you thought fake news only happened these days. Well, I'm thrilled you decided to spend some time with me poking through history's shadows. I could go on, but I hear my grandfather whispering, "Bobby, people will like you better if you find a period and stop talking." And so, I will. Thank you.